In 1937, Aveling-Barford built 3 in every 4 road rollers sold in Britain. 2,000 Grantham men made the machines that paved the M roads and built the foundations of the Aswan High Dam. Then, on New Year's Day 1968, it was sold to British Leyland. Engines that failed in Australian quarries within 2 years. A property sale that produced a foundational English company law judgment. A pension fund investigated by the police. Today, a tipper trailer firm and a precision engineering subcontractor occupy what remains of the foundry. The brass rampant horse of Kent is gone from the gates. Not through one failure. Through 40 years of reasonable decisions, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it. Chapter 1. The Cambridge Boy and the Birch Rod. Thomas Aveling was born on the 11th of September 1824 in the village of Elm, Cambridgeshire, a flat parish of drainage ditches and black fenland soil where farming wasn't a profession, but a sentence. His father died when Thomas was young. His mother remarried the Reverend John de Urban of Hoo St. Werburgh, a clergyman who, by one contemporary's account, raised the boy with a Bible in one hand and a birch rod in the other. It wasn't a childhood built for tenderness. It was a childhood built for endurance, and endurance, as it turned out, was the only raw material Thomas Aveling ever needed. He was apprenticed to Edward Lake, a farmer of Hoo, on the Medway estuary in Kent. Aveling learned the trade. He married Lake's niece Sarah, and by 1851, aged 26, he was farming on his own account at Ruckinge on Romney Marsh, employing 16 men and 6 boys, running a credible operation on land that flooded when the wind blew wrong. He could have stayed. Most men did. But Aveling had a frustration that wouldn't leave him alone, and it was a frustration born of watching something absurd happen over and over again. Portable steam threshing engines, heavy, powerful, perfectly capable of moving themselves, were being hauled from farm to farm by teams of horses. The engine sat on wheels. It had a boiler. It could generate the power to turn those wheels itself. And yet there it sat, dead weight on a flatbed, dragged across rutted Kentish lanes by animals that could have been doing something useful. Aveling watched this. He considered it idiotic. And in 1856, working alongside his father-in-law in a small millwrighting yard at Edwards Yard, Rochester, he did something about it. He built his first steam plough. 3 years later, in 1859, he modified a Clayton and Shuttleworth portable engine into the first self-propelled traction engine. The modification was straightforward in principle, a chain drive connecting the engine's crankshaft to the rear axle, but its implications were enormous. For the first time, a steam engine moved itself down a public road under its own power. The Kentish farming community recognised what they'd witnessed. A subscription was raised. 300 guineas, a substantial sum, was presented to Aveling in recognition. He'd earned a title that would follow him into every engineering textbook written in the next century and a half, the father of the traction engine. And fathers, of course, have children. What Aveling fathered next would pave the modern world. Chapter 2. The Rampant Horse of Kent. What Aveling needed was capital. What he found was Richard Thomas Porter, a businessman, a natural marketeer, and the perfect counterweight to an engineer who thought in iron and torque. In 1862, the two men formed Aveling and Porter. They moved to a foundry at Strood, across the River Medway from Rochester, and they named it the Invicta Works, after the motto of Kent, Invicta, unconquered. The rampant horse of Kent, the rearing white horse that also adorns, through separate heraldic lineages, the arms of Stuttgart, Porsche and Ferrari, was adopted as the firm's emblem around 1865 and registered as a trademark in 1891. It would travel north to Grantham in 1934, preside over the gates of the greatest road roller works in the world, and remain there until 2010. But that was 70 years away. In 1865, the horse had work to do, closer to home. The first practical steam road roller was tested that year at 3 places only: Military Road, Chatham, Star Hill, Rochester, and Hyde Park, London. A 12-ton machine with a smooth iron drum at the front and driving wheels at the rear, steered by a man standing on a platform behind the boiler, pressing heated metal into compacted stone. It worked. The road surface it produced was harder, flatter, and more durable than anything horse-drawn rollers could achieve. The first production roller left the Invicta Works in 1867, bound for Aveling's agent in Paris. The very next year, an Aveling and Porter 15-ton steamroller was shipped across the Atlantic to pave the carriage roads of Central Park, New York. A Kentish foundry was building the roads of Manhattan before the decade was out. The War Office noticed. Aveling and Porter began supplying steam sappers, military road rollers and traction engines to the Royal Engineers. Thomas Lake Aveling, Thomas's son, born in 1856, took over the firm's management in 1881. By the early 1900s, employment at the Rochester Invicta Works had risen from 400 in 1872 to a peak of 1,500. Aveling and Porter were supplying roughly 70% of every road roller sold in Britain, 7 rollers in every 10. The unconquered horse was earning its name. Thomas Aveling himself didn't live to see it. He died on the 7th of March, 1882, aged 57. The Cambridge boy raised on birch rods and fenland endurance, who'd looked at a steam engine being dragged by horses and decided the world could do better. The firm he left behind would outlive him by 128 years. It would not, in the end, outlive the decisions made about it by men who never stood on its foundry floor. Chapter 3. The Combine That Killed Itself. There is a recurring pattern in British industrial history, and it goes like this. A group of successful, independent engineering firms are persuaded to merge into a single combine on the promise of shared overheads and rationalized production. The combine produces nothing but central overhead costs that outweigh the savings. The combine collapses, and from the wreckage, one man, usually younger, usually angrier, usually in personal debt, pulls together enough of the pieces to start again. The combine in this case was Agricultural and General Engineers, AGE, formed in 1919 at the joint instigation of Thomas Lake Aveling and a businessman named Archibald Maconochie. The idea was to rationalize British farm engineering under one corporate roof, 14 subsidiaries, 10,000 employees, a London Stock Exchange listing, and within 13 years, all of it was gone. AGE collapsed into receivership in February 1932. The liquidator broke it up and sold the pieces. One of those pieces was Aveling and Porter. Another was Barford and Perkins, a complementary firm founded in 1871 by William Barford and Thomas Perkins, who'd acquired the Queen Street Iron Works in Peterborough for £2,000. Their product line was smaller, lighter rollers, petrol-engined machines designed for road maintenance work where steam was overkill. There's a detail buried in the Barford and Perkins lineage that matters enormously, though nobody could have known it at the time. Frank Perkins, whose father owned the firm, worked first for the family business and then moved to Aveling and Porter's Rochester Works, where in 1929 he met Charles Chapman, the engineer who would go on to co-invent the world's first practical automobile diesel engine. The two men whose work powered post-war British motoring met on the shop floor of what would become Aveling-Barford. History was being assembled in the machine shops before anyone had drawn up the plans. The man who rescued the wreckage was Edward James Barford. Born on the 23rd of April 1898, Barford was a rugby schoolboy who enlisted as a private in 1915, aged 17. By 20 he was acting major. He was twice wounded, severely gassed, twice mentioned in dispatches and awarded the Military Cross. By 1932 he was personal assistant to AGE's chairman and, by his own account, increasingly dissatisfied with the poor management that was dragging the combine to its grave. When AGE collapsed, Barford raised the funds to save both Barford and Perkins and Aveling and Porter from the receiver. He was, at the time, several £1,000s in personal debt. The backing came from Ruston and Hornsby of Lincoln, R.A. Lister & Co., and Ransom's, Sims and Jeffries, established engineering houses who saw what Barford saw, that the products were sound, the brand was trusted, and the management had been the only thing wrong. The rescue created a new company, Aveling-Barford Limited. Edward James Barford was its chairman. He would hold that position for 35 years, and the first decision he made would define everything that followed. Chapter 4. The 10,000 tons. North Ruston and Hornsby of Lincoln had a surplus 36-acre site at the top of Houghton Road in Grantham, a former boiler works and First World War shadow factory where they'd built submarine engines. George Ruston Sharpley, Ruston and Hornsby's managing director, offered Barford a long lease, running 75 years to 2009. The condition was contractual and non-negotiable. Every machine Aveling-Barford built would use Ruston and Hornsby diesel engines. Grantham Borough Council sealed the deal by pledging to build council housing for essential workers, the Walton Gardens estate on the south side of town. The move from Rochester to Grantham took place in early 1934, and Edward Barford's promotional booklet recorded the scale of it with undisguised pride. It constituted, Barford wrote, one of the largest factory removals ever undertaken by the LNER and Southern Railway, entailing the transportation of the whole of the works plant, stores and effects, amounting to nearly 10,000 tons. 10,000 tons of engineering heritage, loaded onto railway wagons in Kent and unloaded in Lincolnshire. Among the cargo was a small standard-gauge shunting locomotive, built by Aveling and Porter for their own use in Rochester in 1898. A works engine that made the journey north and quietly ran the Grantham sidings beside the East Coast Main Line until about 1952, when it was scrapped off Dysart Road. Nobody photographed its last journey. Nobody thought to. The board of the new company reflected the alliance that had made it possible. Edward James Barford as chairman, his cousin William Geoffrey Barford as director. From Ruston and Hornsby, George Ruston Sharpley and John Heinrich Wolf Paulin, the latter also a director of ransoms in Ipswich. It was a tight group, men who knew engineering, knew each other, and knew what a 36-acre Lincolnshire site could become if the product was right and the management was disciplined. On the 29th of June 1937, Aveling-Barford was listed on the London Stock Exchange. Capital raised, £320,000. The firm that very year claimed to build 75% of all road rollers sold in Britain, 3 rollers in every 4. The rampant horse of Kent, the same emblem that had presided over the Strood foundry, was now mounted in brass above the Grantham gates, and Grantham, a quiet Lincolnshire market town on the Great North Road, was being transformed into something it had never been before, a company town. The product range expanded fast. The 12-ton Aveling dumper, introduced in 1938, was Britain's first mass-produced site dumper. There were dairy cooling systems, cooking ranges for hospitals, hotels and works canteens. The licensed Leyland concrete road jointing system, developed on the German autobahns of the late 1930s. Edward Barford wasn't building a road roller manufacturer. He was building a heavy engineering empire, and the Invicta Works on Houghton Road was its capital. Chapter 5. The foundry at war. When war came in September 1939, the Invicta Works converted with the speed that only a heavy engineering plant can manage. The machine shops that had been cutting axle splines for road rollers were now machining components for Bren gun carriers and Lloyd carriers, the light armoured vehicles that would carry British infantry across North Africa and Normandy. The foundry cast shell fuse caps. The fitting shops produced what the army called calf dozers, small bulldozers built for combat engineering, compact enough to be loaded onto landing craft. Precision components for tanks and submarines moved through the same bays where dump truck chassis had stood 6 months earlier. Of the workforce who left Houghton Road for the armed services, 17 men did not return. Their names are inscribed by surname only on a wavy-headed plaque set in a freestanding wall at the works gate, beneath the Invicta horse. In grateful remembrance and deep appreciation of the personnel of Aveling-Barford Ltd, who lost their lives in the 1939-1945 war. The Imperial War Museum holds it as Memorial Number 3706. The surnames are not published online. They remain at the gate, or what was once the gate, where their colleagues would have passed them every morning for 65 years. Among the wartime leadership at the Invicta Works was Fitzherbert Wright, works director and grandfather of Sarah Ferguson, the future Duchess of York. It's the sort of detail that sounds like a footnote, but it captures something about the social world of mid-century British engineering. The men who ran these works moved through the same networks as the men who ran the country. Aveling-Barford wasn't a backwater. It was a nationally significant enterprise whose directors were known in Whitehall, in the city, and in the shires. Peace brought a boom. A new factory opened at Newcastle upon Tyne on the 17th of September 1946. 2 new subsidiaries, Barford Developments LLT and Barford Agricultural Ltd, were formed in April 1946. And in 1947, 6 miles from Grantham at Belton, Barfords of Belton developed something entirely unexpected, the Barford Atom. At 80 kilograms, it was the world's smallest tractor, a machine so tiny it could be lifted by 2 men, designed for market gardens and small holdings where a full-size tractor would have been absurd. It was a footnote to the main product line. But it was a footnote that revealed something important about the culture at Aveling-Barford. These were engineers who liked solving problems. All problems, even the small ones. The deal that would shape the next quarter-century came in 1949. Aveling-Barford agreed with Austin Western Inc. of Aurora, Illinois, to build their motor graders under license, heavy machines for road construction, sold as Aveling Austin and later under the Invicta Shield logo. Critically, the license specified that only British-built engines would be fitted: Leyland, Rolls-Royce, Perkins, AEC. In New Zealand, where Dominion Motors sold hundreds, drivers nicknamed them ambling bastards, a term of abuse that was also, in the way of construction workers everywhere, a term of grudging affection. The Ministry of Works fielded Aveling Austin graders in every operating district in the country. They weren't fast, they weren't glamorous, they were dependable, and in the post-war world, dependable was the only currency that mattered. By the early 1950s, 70% of Aveling-Barford's output was exported. The group had subsidiaries in Paris, Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Port Elizabeth, Salisbury and Rhodesia, Caracas, Toronto and Sydney. The rampant horse of Kent was stamped on machines working in African quarries, Australian mines, Venezuelan oil fields and New Zealand hill country roads. A single Lincolnshire town was supplying the post-war world with the equipment to rebuild itself. Chapter 6. The Master Pavior. The Invicta Works at its peak was a 36-acre rectangle on the south side of Grantham, wedged between Houghton Road and the East Coast Main Line. The internal railway, a standard gauge system of sidings and traverses, crossed beneath the Great North Road through a separate arch next to the mainline bridge. Iron-roofed machine shops, the plate shop, the paint shop, the foundry, the drawing office, the weighbridge, a sports field at Arnold Field in Gonaby Hill Foot, an enormous social club hall at Houghton Road, used in 1939 as cinema and stage, and destroyed by fire later that year, because works social clubs in Lincolnshire were apparently not immune to the hazards of the age. A young man arriving for his first shift in the 1950s would have smelled the foundry before he reached the gates. Hot iron and moulding sand, the acrid sweetness of molten metal that clung to overalls and never quite washed out. Inside, the noise was a physical thing. Castings from the foundry, and from the Ruston and Hornsby foundry next door, moved into the machine shops where Parkinson plane mills cut splines on dumper axles. Assembly ran on rails inside the plate shop. The paint shop produced the colour that would define the brand for half a century. Aveling yellow. Finished machines departed by rail through the Elner siding, directly into the world. A roller assembled on Monday morning in Grantham could be on a ship to Mombasa by Friday. The men who built them were Grantham men. The works fielded its own football team, Aveling-Barford FC, photographed in 1939 outside the canteen. Names recorded on the back: Arthur Hakes, Inspector; Alf Ambrose, Tool Room; Freddie Cox, Fitter; Walter Bedford, Driller; Bob Clark, Repairs; Reg Christmas, Dispatch; Bill Merchant, Paint Shop; and the nicknames that surface from the Grantham Matters Community Archive: Boxer Bingham, Porky Eels. These weren't anonymous production line operatives. They were tradesmen with skills specific enough to carry nicknames, men known by what they did and how well they did it. Houghton Road at 4:30 in the afternoon was a sight that anyone who lived in Grantham in those years still remembers. One worker's recollection, preserved on the Grantham Matters community page, captures the scene. Houghton Road used to be choked with cars and men in blue overalls on bikes at 4:30. Real people with real jobs, all gone. It wasn't just a shift change, it was the pulse of a town. Grantham rose and fell with the works hooter. The machines that earned all of this were the GA, GB and GC diesel rollers, and above all, the legendary Master Pavior series. The GNT, GNS and GNR Master Paviors, introduced in the 1950s, were the definitive post-war British road roller. Operating weights from 7.5 to 15 tons, multi-cylinder diesel engines, enclosed cabs, precision gearboxes that gave the operator surgical control over compaction pressure. They were heavy, slow, indestructible, and unmistakable. Painted Aveling yellow, the rampant horse cast into the engine cowling, built to outlast the roads they paved. and they did outlast them. Working master paviors survive today, 70 years on, in preservation collections and council depots across the country. In the early 1960s, 54 Aveling-Barford 30-ton SN series dumpers built the foundations of the Aswan High Dam. Stage 1, the coffer dam that held back the Nile while the main structure rose behind it. 54 machines from a single Lincolnshire works, operating in Egyptian heat, hauling fill material for one of the largest civil engineering projects in human history. The SN series was also supplied to the Royal Engineers across the British military estate, 30-ton dump trucks painted military green, the Invicta horse discreet on the bonnet, working on bases from Aldershot to Aden. And then there was the toy. In 1953, Lesney Products issued the Matchbox No. 1 road roller, modelled directly on an Aveling-Barford diesel road roller. It was produced across 4 distinct castings, from the 1A through to the final 1D, which ran from 1962 to 1967 before being replaced in the range by a Mercedes LP covered truck. For 15 continuous years, an Aveling-Barford road roller sat in millions of British children's pockets. It was the very first Matchbox model, No. 1 in the series, the one that started everything. A whole generation's understanding of what a road roller looked like was shaped by a die-cast miniature of a machine built in Grantham. The Reverend W. Audrey completed the cultural saturation. George the Steamroller, the irascible, road-obsessed antagonist of the railway series, and Fergus the railway traction engine were both modelled on Aveling and Porter machines. When they were translated to the Thomas the Tank Engine television series, the big yellow roller of British childhood imagination became a cartoon character that parents recognised and children adored. The Aveling wasn't just a machine anymore, it was a cultural object, as embedded in post-war British consciousness as the red telephone box or the Routemaster bus. At its peak, the Aveling-Barford group employed around 2,500 people. Approximately 2,000 of them worked at the Grantham site, making the Invicta Works the town's largest single employer by a considerable margin. Peak workforce, peak exports, peak cultural presence. The Summit. Chapter 7. The Pheasant Shoot at Scopwick. Friday, the 29th of November, 1963. 6 days after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Conservative Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Home travels to Grantham, stays overnight at Leadenham Hall with the local Conservative chairman, Lieutenant Colonel William Reeve, and from 1 o'clock in the afternoon tours the Invicta Works on the arm of Chairman Edward Barford. The two men walk the shop floor together, the Prime Minister in a dark overcoat, Barford in the suit he always wore on official days, past the foundry, through the machine shops, along the assembly rails where master paviors stood in various stages of completion. Afterwards, pheasant shooting at Scopwick, then dinner at the George Hotel. It was the summit. The ledger was healthy. The master pavior was selling worldwide. Exports ran at 3/4 of everything the works produced. The Queen's Award to Industry would come in April 1967. The Queen's Award for Export followed in April 1972. Edward Barford, chairman, Lloyd's underwriter, Military Cross, was at the peak of his influence, showing the Prime Minister around a works that represented everything British heavy engineering was supposed to be: independent, profitable, exporting, employing a town. But the warning signs were already there, visible only if you knew where to look. Caterpillar had opened its French operation at Grenoble in 1961, acquiring the French firm Richier and starting with around 300 employees. Its Belgian assembly plant at Gosselies followed in the early 60s. The Americans weren't just exporting machines anymore. They were building them inside Europe, inside the tariff wall, inside the market that Aveling-Barford had always treated as its own. And in Japan, something quieter and more dangerous was happening. Komatsu, under President Ryoichi Kawai, who took over in 1964, had won the Deming Prize for quality control that same year and publicly declared the company's explicit goal to surpass Caterpillar. In 1967, Komatsu established its first overseas subsidiary, NV Komatsu Europe SA, in Belgium. The Japanese weren't coming for Aveling-Barford specifically, they were coming for the entire world construction equipment market. Aveling-Barford just happened to be standing in the path. Closer to home, JCB was rising. Joseph Cyril Bamford's backhoe loaders were transforming the British construction site, eating into the market for the dedicated single-function machines that Aveling-Barford built. And behind the brass gates on Houghton Road, the product line was showing its age. The motor graders still relied on a single 1949 American license from Austin Western. The Ruston and Hornsby diesel engines, contractually mandated by a lease signed in 1934, were beginning to look dated against newer, lighter power units. At the moment the Prime Minister toured the Invicta Works and pronounced himself impressed, the forces that would destroy it were already in motion. Caterpillar was inside Europe. Komatsu was setting the explicit goal of world domination. JCB was rewriting the rules of British construction equipment. And in the wings, not yet visible, but already calculating, Donald Stokes was preparing to take the chair at the Leyland Motor Corporation. The pheasants fell at Scopwick that Friday afternoon. Edward Barford hosted his guest. The works hooter sounded at 4:30, and 2,000 men in blue overalls poured out of the Houghton Road gates on their bicycles and into the November dusk. It was the last uncomplicated day the Invicta Works would ever know. Chapter 8. Lord Stokes Comes Calling. Donald Stokes was appointed chairman and managing director of the Leyland Motor Corporation on the 27th of April 1967, following the retirement of Sir William Black. He was already, that spring, in covert merger talks with British Motor Holdings, talks encouraged by Tony Benn at the Ministry of Technology and backed by the Wilson government's Industrial Reorganisation Corporation, which believed that British industry's salvation lay in scale. Bigger companies, bigger balance sheets, bigger overheads. It was the age philosophy of 1919 dressed in 1960s Whitehall language, and it would produce the same result, only this time the collapse would take 4 decades instead of 13 years. During those very merger talks, Stokes pushed Leyland to acquire Aveling-Barford. His reasoning was corporate strategy at its most seductive. Leyland needed a foothold in the construction equipment business. Aveling-Barford was profitable, independent, Queen's Award-winning, exporting 3/4 of its output and, crucially, small enough to absorb without a fight. In November 1967, Leyland offered £9,250,000. The Aveling-Barford board accepted. JCB also bid. Anthony Bamford, son of the founder, later Sir Anthony, later Lord Bamford, wanted the Grantham works. He was turned away. The board preferred Leyland's money, Leyland's name, and Leyland's promise of investment and expanded export reach through Leyland's global commercial vehicle network. It was a reasonable decision. It was also a catastrophic one. But that's how catastrophe usually arrives in British boardrooms, wearing a good suit, carrying impressive projections, promising synergies. The takeover completed on the 1st of January 1968. Just 5 months later, in May 1968, Leyland Motor Corporation merged with British Motor Holdings to form the British Leyland Motor Corporation. 100 companies, 200,000 employees, a sprawling conglomerate that Donald Stokes himself privately described as unwieldy. Aveling-Barford was now a subdivision of a subdivision. The brass rampant horse still stood above the Grantham gates, but the decisions about what happened behind those gates were now being made in offices that had never heard the works hooter and never would. Edward Barford, chairman since 1933, the man who'd rescued the firm from receivership in his personal debt, who'd moved 10,000 tons north by railway, who'd walked the Prime Minister through the machine shops, retired that same year, 1968. He was 70. He'd held the chairmanship for 35 years. Colin Ryan, managing director since 1956, became chairman in 1969. But Ryan was now answering to Leyland, and Leyland had conditions. The first condition was engines. As part of the takeover agreement, Aveling-Barford was required to phase out the trusted Ruston and Hornsby diesels that had powered every machine since 1934, the contractual obligation of the original Houghton Road lease, and replace them with Leyland engines. It was presented as standardization. It was experienced, on the shop floor and in the field, as sabotage. The Leyland diesels were unreliable. Within 2 years, Aveling-Barford machines fitted with the new engines were failing in Australian quarries, overheating, seizing, breaking down in conditions that the Ruston and Hornsby units had handled for decades without complaint. The men in Grantham who'd built those machines knew the engines were wrong. The operators in the field who ran them knew they were wrong. The only people who didn't know, or didn't care to know, were the men at Leyland head office who'd mandated the change. In 1969, the Grantham Matters Community Archive preserves a photograph, the Aveling-Barford workforce out on strike at the top of Houghton Road. It was the first of many. The relationship between the Grantham Works and its new owners had curdled within 18 months, and then Leyland began dismantling the works from the inside. In September 1975, Leyland bought Thomas Ward of Gainsborough for £3 million and moved Aveling-Barford's tractor shovel, front loader, manufacturing out of Grantham to Gainsborough. The product line that had been built, tested and refined in Grantham for decades was lifted out of the town and set down 40 miles away. Simultaneously, because Leyland had also acquired Marshall Fowler, the Grantham operation was rebranded Aveling-Marshall, a name that meant nothing to anyone, that carried none of the heritage, that existed solely because a conglomerate's organisational chart required it. The rampant horse was still on the gates, but the works behind them was being hollowed out, one product line at a time, by men who measured value in rationalisation diagrams, not in machines. Edward James Barford died on the 11th of July 1979. He was 81. The works he'd built from the wreckage of age, the works he'd moved 10,000 tons to create, was by then deep inside a nationalised conglomerate that was bleeding money from every division. Whether Barford lived long enough to understand what Leyland had done to his life's work is a question the record doesn't answer. The record does answer what happened next. Chapter 9. The dressed-up distribution. The crisis arrived with the force of a decade's worth of deferred decisions landing at once. In December 1979, British Leyland, itself nationalised and hemorrhaging public money, announced it was looking to sell Aveling-Barford. By the early 1980s, the company was loss-making. Of the 1,100 workers remaining at Grantham, 800 faced redundancy unless the company was drastically restructured. In 1979, the construction equipment firm Acro had wanted to buy Barford's. The deal collapsed. Meanwhile, Leyland had created a holding structure, Leyland Special Products, later SP Industries, headquartered at Sisonby Lodge on Nottingham Road in Melton Mowbray. Managing Director from 1978, David Abel, Chairman of Aveling-Barford Holdings, formed in September 1978, David Abel, Managing Director of the operating company, Leslie Wharton, succeeded by Jack Smart by 1980. £6.5 million was invested in the late 70s into Grantham and Newcastle, and 500 additional staff were taken on. It looked, briefly, like a rescue. It wasn't. On the 21st of December 1983, Aveling-Barford was sold by British Leyland to Reed Echalier, a Pennsylvanian businessman born on the 3rd of December 1934. Turnover at handover was £32 million. The dumper trucks and road rollers were still profitable. The brand still commanded respect in the field. What Echalier acquired was a company that had been starved of research and development for 15 years, stripped of its tractor shovel line, forcibly rebranded, saddled with unreliable engines, and shaken by repeated redundancy rounds, but whose core products, built by men who knew how to build them, still worked. The skeleton was sound. The question was whether the new owner would feed it or strip it. The answer came in a transaction so disgraceful it produced a foundational English company law judgment. In 1978, under the controlling shareholder Dr. Lee, a figure distinct from the Echalier-era management, Aveling-Barford Ltd sold a country house and 18 acres of land in Grantham to a connected company, Perion Ltd, for £350,000. The property had been valued for prospective mortgagees at £1,150,000. The difference, £800,000, vanished into Perion's balance sheet. The case reached Mr. Justice Hoffman, later Lord Hoffman, one of the most influential English commercial judges of the 20th century, who ruled in Aveling-Barford Ltd. Av Perion Ltd, reported at 1989, BCLC 626, in terms that left no room for ambiguity. This was a dressed-up distribution. It was held to be an ultra vires unlawful return of capital, a transaction designed to extract value from the company for the benefit of a connected party, disguised as an arm's-length sale. The judgment established, in English law, the principle that a company cannot return capital to its shareholders by the back door, by selling assets at an undervalue to connected persons and pretending the transaction is commercial. Every company law student in Britain reads Aveling-Barford v. Perion. It is a foundation case on directors' duties. It is taught in every university that teaches English commercial law, and it originated in the asset stripping of a Grantham heavy engineering firm whose workers had no idea it was happening. The company didn't survive the decade. On the 14th of June 1988, insolvency was triggered by a debenture taken out in 1986. The works that had employed 2,000 men was placed in the hands of receivers. By October 1988, what remained was sold to Wordsworth Holdings, owned by Duncan Wordsworth, an entrepreneur who had previously run the Coles Cranes plant at Sunderland. Wordsworth bought a name, a depleted order book, a workforce that had been through 15 years of corporate betrayal, and a set of buildings on a lease that had 31 years left to run. But the worst revelation was still to come. In February 1989, Lincolnshire police opened an investigation into the Aveling-Barford pension scheme. The fund, originally administered by Equity and Law, later absorbed by AXA, had a discrepancy. The polite word was discrepancy. In late April 1989, Royal Insurance agreed to fill the gap, to bail out the missing money. The investigation continued. The Derbyshire Fraud Squad assisted, and from the 16th of March to the 14th of April 1992, a trial was held at Birmingham Crown Court. In August 1992, a pension scheme trustee was sentenced to imprisonment. 3 other defendants were cleared of fraud. The trustee's name and the exact sum missing from the pension fund survive only in the Grantham Journal and Lincolnshire Echo coverage held at Lincolnshire Archives and the British Newspaper Archive. Beyond open source reach, and therefore beyond this script's ability to state. What can be stated is this: the men who had spent their working lives building road rollers and dump trucks at the Invicta Works learned from the Lincolnshire police that someone had been inside their pension fund. They learned this not from their employer, not from their union, not from their trustees, but from detectives. That is the kind of fact that doesn't require editorial commentary. It speaks for itself. Chapter 10. The Last Yellow Truck. The last 30-ton dumper truck rolled out of the Invicta Works in October 2005, not 2010. October 2005, a full 5 years before the company itself collapsed. The team who built it were photographed by Robin Orry, who later brought the picture into the offices of the Grantham Journal. The men and women in the photograph, Robin Orry himself, Paul Bird, Mick Johnson, Howard Skeeth, Andy Price, Dave Williams, Mick Harrison, Pat Muxlow, Mary Smith, Joe Lewis. The model was, in all likelihood, an RD-030, the 30-ton rigid dumper that had been the backbone of the production line since the 1970s. 10 people. The photograph records 10 people standing beside the last heavy machine to carry the Aveling-Barford name out of Grantham. 10 from a peak of 2,000. By the time that photograph was taken, the foundry had been cold for years. The assembly rails were idle. The paint shop that had produced Aveling yellow in industrial quantities was producing nothing. The machine that Orre and his colleagues built that October was not the end of a production run. It was the end of a tradition that stretched back to Thomas Aveling's first steamroller at Hyde Park in 1865. 140 years of continuous British heavy machine manufacturing, ending not with a ceremony or a speech, but with a small group of people, a camera and a truck that would be delivered and then forgotten. What followed was an intellectual property fire sale conducted at a pace that suggested the owners knew what they had and wanted rid of it before anyone asked too many questions. In 2006, Singapore-based ST Kinetics bought the rights to the RXD series articulated dump trucks, the most advanced machines Aveling-Barford had ever designed. They were rebadged under the TRX Build brand, Grantham's engineering, Singapore's nameplate. In August 2007, Norway's Moxie Engineering announced plans to buy the intellectual property rights to the Barford rigid dump truck range. The line that had built the Aswan Dam, supplied the Royal Engineers, and earned the Queen's Award for export. A prototype was exhibited at Bauma 2007, the world's largest construction equipment trade fair. Then, in 2008, South Korea's Doosan, formerly Daewoo, acquired Moxie and renamed it Doosan Moxie AS. The proposed Aveling-Barford-derived rigid range was cancelled. The prototype was scrapped. The engineering drawings, the tooling specifications, the accumulated knowledge of how to build a 30-ton rigid dump truck that could work an Egyptian quarry in 50-degree heat, all of it dispersed into corporate filing cabinets in Oslo and Seoul, where it would never be used, and in 2009 the long lease expired. The 75-year lease that George Ruston Sharpley had granted Edward Barford in 1934, the lease that had brought 10,000 tons of engineering north from Rochester, that had built the Invicta Works, that had mandated Ruston and Hornsby engines in every machine, that had underpinned the entire existence of Aveling-Barford in Grantham, quietly reached its term. 75 years. The lease outlasted the product. The contract outlasted the company. The paperwork survived longer than the machines. The administration came on the 11th of March 2010. Wordsworth Holdings plc and its subsidiaries, Barford Site Dumpers, Fruhoff Trailers, WH Rentals, were placed in the hands of joint administrators from Deloitte, Chris Farrington, Dominic Wong, and David Langton. The combined Grantham workforce of the entire group was approximately 225 people, a tenth of the 1970s peak, a hundredth of what the site had once been. Duncan Wordsworth spoke to the Grantham Journal. His words carried the exhaustion of a man who had fought for 22 years to keep something alive and had run out of road. "We have survived 2 previous recessions," he said. However, this last recession has been unprecedented in both the speed and the depth with which it hit. We believed that the actions we had taken during the last 2 years were going to be enough to save the business. But with the uncertainty surrounding the forthcoming election, we have found that orders for our products, and the sentence trails away. The Grantham Journal recorded the ellipsis. Wordsworth couldn't finish the thought. There was nothing left to say. Chris Farrington of Deloitte issued the formal industry statement. The Fruhoff and Barford Site Dumpers businesses have particularly strong market positions and a reputation for innovative products. They have historically been profitable, but in the current economic environment, have been faced with a significant reduction in demand. It was the language of administration, accurate, bloodless, and completely incapable of conveying what it meant to the 225 people whose livelihoods depended on what happened next. 2 months later, on the 11th of May 2010, the Bowden Investment Group, a private equity firm based in Altrincham, Cheshire, founded in 2007, acquired the Barford Site Dumper business and operated it as Barford Construction Equipment Ltd, later trading as Invicta's Engineering, from a portion of the Grantham factory. Stanhay Webb was bought back by ex-directors Niall Wordsworth and John Evans. Fruhoff was reconstituted as a separate trailer manufacturing concern. But Plant and Engineering Services magazine was blunt about what the Bowden rescue actually meant. In 2010, Barford went into administration, they wrote, and that was effectively the end of the Barford dumper product, as there was no buyer interested for the administrator to sell to. No buyer for the dumper line that had built the Aswan Dam, for the rigid trucks that had supplied the Royal Engineers, for the machines that had carried the rampant horse of Kent across 6 continents. No buyer. The word interested is the one that cuts deepest. Not that nobody could afford it, that nobody wanted it. Chapter 11. Beneath the Tarmac. The Houghton Road site today is not the sanitised retail park of folk memory. It is something quieter and stranger, an industrial half-life. MV Fruhoff Ltd assembles tipper trailers in part of the old plant, describing itself as occupying a 64-acre Grantham site. Invicta's engineering machines, precision components in the workshops where Parkinson plane mills once cut splines on dumper axles. Shell Plant Limited, which took over Aveling-Barford parts supply on the 12th of October 2015, holds the spare parts inventory, the last physical connection to the machines themselves. 3 firms, working in fragments of a foundry that once paved the modern world. The 1933 council houses of Walton Gardens, built to lure Aveling-Barford's essential workers north from Rochester, still stand on the south side of town. B&Q occupies the adjoining former Ruston and Hornsby site, not the Aveling-Barford foundry footprint. That's a common local conflation, and it matters to get it right, because the truth is sadder than the folk version. The foundry wasn't bulldozed for a DIY superstore. It was absorbed into a landscape of smaller, quieter enterprises that carry no memory of what stood there before them. Wicky's is on Gonaby Road, about a mile north, also not on the foundry footprint. Arnold Field, the original Barford sports ground at Gonaby Hill Foot, still exists. On the 3rd of June 2016, 5 fire crews from Grantham, Sleaford, Newark and Billingborough fought a blaze on the former Aveling-Barford site. About 3,000 litres of paint thinner were destroyed. There were unconfirmed reports that the fire may have been arson. No injuries. No one was ever charged. A 3,000-litre paint thinner fire on the site of a works whose paint shop once produced Aveling yellow by the drumload. The irony wrote itself. The heritage survives in fragments. The Lincolnshire archives at Lincoln hold the surviving build records, product catalogues, photographs and engineering plans, many predating the 1934 merger. The Road Roller Association's Motor Roller Register lists about 150 surviving Aveling-Barford motor rollers. Approximately 600 Aveling and Porter steam machines survive worldwide, out of an estimated 12,200 built. Beamish Museum is restoring an early Barford and Perkins D series. The Pallet Steam Museum in Jersey holds a fully restored 1912 Aveling and Porter steamroller. Paul Dodd, a former Aveling-Barford engineer who became a lecturer at Grantham College in 2005, has digitised the company's promotional films, supplied to him by colleague Brian Hollingshead before the 2010 closure. The films survive because one man thought to ask and another thought to hand them over. That's how industrial memory works in this country. Not through institutions, through individuals who care enough to carry it. In October 2012, Grantham's community radio station Gravity FM produced a tribute in words and music to Aveling-Barford. It aired once. There is no indication it was repeated. The Matchbox No. 1 road roller still trades on eBay for a few pounds. George the Steamroller still appears on children's television. The big yellow road roller of British cultural memory, the one in Thomas the Tank Engine, the one in millions of pockets, the one painted on every primary school mural depicting post-war road building, is, more often than not, an Aveling. The first job of this documentary was to reconnect that childhood image to a real foundry, a real town, a real war memorial, real men. The last job is to say what happened to them. The brass rampant horse is gone from the gates. The 17 surnames of the men who died in the Second World War remain on the wavy-headed plaque set into a freestanding wall. Memorial number 3706 in the Imperial War Museum's War Memorials Register. The surnames are not published online. They are there, at Houghton Road, where they have been since 1945. Below the horse that is no longer there. Beside the gates that no longer open onto a foundry. And beneath the tarmac of the modern industrial estate, beneath the staff car park, beneath the turning circles of the tipper trailers, the rails of Aveling-Barford's Internal Works Railway are still in place. The tracks that carried finished road rollers from the assembly shop to the East Coast mainline siding. The rails that the 1898 Rochester shunting locomotive ran on before it was scrapped, unrecorded, off Dysart Road. The weighbridge fixings, the sleeper beds, all of it buried, none of it removed. A railway under the car park, a foundry under the silence. Grantham is the town of Margaret Thatcher's birth, the town that built the diesel engine in 1892 at Hornsby's, the first British tractor in 1896, and the road rollers that paved the modern world. It is now a market town on the A1, better known for its service area, its retail parks, and its food processing remnants. The works hooter doesn't sound anymore. Houghton Road isn't choked with cars and men in blue overalls at 4:30. The real people with real jobs are gone, and if you drive past at the right time of day, in the right light, and you know what you're looking for, you might notice the slight unevenness in the tarmac where the rails run underneath, the last trace of a works that built the machines, that built the roads, that built the country. Not through one failure, through 40 years of reasonable decisions, a takeover, a merger, a rebranding, an engine change, a pension fraud, an asset strip, an IP sale, an expired lease, each one moving the work a little further from the hands that knew how to do it, until the hooter sounded for the last time and nobody came in on Monday.